Hey buddy. Well, you clicked on the video, so we both know why you're here. We'll jump straight into it. This is a 2009 Pontiac G8 GT, and it has been swapped from an automatic transmission over to a manual transmission. And we've got a TR6060 in it from Tremec that was built specifically for the GXP version of this car. Those of you watching this video probably already know that the only way to get a manual transmission in this car originally was if you got the GXP trim level, which is the upper trim level. That came with a 6.2 liter LS3. This one has a 6 liter L76 engine. And according to the internet, the numbers for manual GXP is somewhere south of 900. There were 800 and some odd manual GXPs sold here in the United States, and makes it a pretty rare bird. So instead of going for a GXP manual, I've had this car for about 7 years now, we decided, you know what, let's just go ahead and manual swap this one. So this video here is going to be an explanation. Think of it kind of like a podcast format where I'm just going to be sitting and talking to you guys about everything we went through, the parts we have in this car, things to know, things to watch out for, kind of a one-shot video, hopefully giving you a good amount of information. Now, with that, I will just jump straight into the first part here, and that's going to be frequently asked questions that come with this sort of manual swap. Number one question usually I hear is, how difficult is it? Well, it ain't easy, I will tell you that. It's way more than an oil change. Here's your over-under, what I would say as far as difficulty goes. If you clicked on this video hoping for it to be a step-by-step tutorial, it ain't gonna be that, and that's kind of your gauge as to whether, I would say, if you have the skill set to take this on by yourself. If you need a step-by-step tutorial on taking the automatic transmission out of this car, you're gonna be a little bit over your head, because it's easier to take everything out than it is to put all this new stuff in. So with that, I would say, I'm not trying to be condescending or offensive, I would not have taken this on myself, just based on my research that I'd already done over the past few years. I have a very good buddy of mine who builds and works on hot rods. He has a shop a few minutes down the road from me. He was willing to allow me to come over there. We used his shop, his tools, his lift, and a lot of his expertise. I helped, I learned a lot, but he was crucial on getting this sort of thing done. So if you don't know how to take out an automatic transmission, get yourself some friends that hopefully work for beer, some mechanically inclined friends I should also mention, or take it to a performance shop. This would be more than what any normal little Jiffy Lube would want to be able to take on. So take it to a good performance shop, pay them the money. Hey, there's no shame in that. But either way, just know that's kind of your difficulty level. And I would like to add to that and just say that it was easier probably to do this 3 to 5 or so years ago. It's kind of become a reverse bell curve. In the beginning, people were starting to manual swap these at about 2010, 2012. It's October 2022 right now as I make this video, so 10 years ago, right? It started then, people had to figure it all out. So that was peak difficulty. How do you go about manual swapping these? Where do you get the parts, etc.? Then it got sorted out, and people, the information was out there, albeit it was scattered all over forums and everything, but it was out there, so it got kind of easier. There was a point where you could do a full manual swap on this car just looking through a GM parts catalog, ordering everything through there. Well, now the bell curve has kind of swung back up. It's gotten more difficult, mostly because some of the crucial parts are discontinued now. For example, the GXP manual drive shaft is no longer available. The wiring harness for the GXP manual is no longer available. You have to get more resourceful and creative, or just spend more money to do custom stuff to make this work. So if you're considering doing this, if you've been considering doing this and you have one of these cars, now's the time to jump on it, because it's probably just going to get more difficult as time goes by. So there's your somewhat long-winded answer about how difficult it is. Now, I should also mention the reason I'm making this video is because I mentioned the forums. The information is scattered everywhere. I've been looking into this for quite some time, and You go to the Facebook groups, you go to the forum pages, some of the information is old now, some doesn't apply based on the fact that parts are discontinued. It's all over the place. So hopefully this is kind of helpful to you in the modern day 2022. I will shout out another YouTube channel that just recently popped up called Doomed Garage, D-O-O-M-E-D Garage. And he just did a manual swap on his. His was using a used Camaro TR6060 transmission, which is probably going to be what most people are going to do nowadays. And I would probably say there's probably more Camaro transmission swap G8s than there are GXP transmission G8s out there. So go check out his channel. He had a couple videos talking about some of the stuff he's gone through. So between us, hopefully we can give you some good information if you're looking to do this. Now, the second big question that normally gets asked is, how much does it cost? How much do you have in it? Well, I have myself a spreadsheet. And right now, grand total in parts, I'm looking at $7,196.04. Now, granted, that is probably a little bit of crayon math because I probably didn't account for every single thing. Like, for example, we had to make trips to Ace Hardware for bolts and stuff. That's not included in here. Little things like that. Now, if you've done one of these before, or if you've been reading some of the old information, that number I just threw out there sounds kind of high. And that's justified if you believe that, because I've got some kind of higher end parts in this car. You can do it cheaper than $7,196.04. It can be done cheaper, especially if you're using a used transmission. This transmission is brand new. You can go with a GM type clutch setup, supposedly, instead of what I have in this, which is a Monster twin disc. I'll explain the parts I have in this car as we go on. The main reason why this one is a little bit more expensive, this is probably one of the more expensive ways to go about doing this, is I autocross this car. I autocross this car at least once a month. And based on that sort of thing, I also want to do track days with this car, another reason for me doing the manual. So I'm kind of overbuilding it, I hope, to just make it work for this sort of performance driving type stuff. If you're a cars and coffee type of guy, girl, whatever, and you just like to row through the gears and nothing crazy, and you've got like a bolt-on car, then you could go with a, not quite as elaborate setup as I went with. Now, can you do this for $2,000 total? I would say probably no. The way I would factor it in is budget $5,000 if you're using somewhat normal-ish parts. If you're working with yourself and maybe some friends that are willing to work cheap or for beer. Factor about $5,000. And if you come in under that, hey, pleasantly surprised. But at least $5,000 to do this properly, to do it right. Now, keep in mind also, though, I will say that does not include reselling some of the parts I've taken out of this car. For example, like the automatic transmission. If you've got a relatively low mile, good condition 6L80E that comes out of this car, boom, you can recoup some cost. So mine is just straight cost that I've quoted you right now, just in parts. To add to that, my buddy with the shop where we did the work, he kind of threw out a ballpark number. He said, if somebody were to bring this to me and had all the parts and everything went together properly, he threw out a rough labor number of about $3,500 if he was to do all the work. So this could very well be a $10,000 swap if you want it to be. But there's different ways to do this, different desired results. So there you go. There's your number that I've thrown out for you. Let's go back to my notes. And one of the last big questions that you hear is it worth it? To 99% of the people out there, I would say no. It's not worth it because you've made the car more difficult to drive. It's more involved to drive now. You can't just sit there with a big gulp between your legs and a ham sandwich in one hand. No, you have to row gears, you have to work a clutch, you have to steer. To me though, yes, it is totally worth it. I've been looking into this for quite some time, and it's freaking fantastic, man. It's a big, happy sports sedan with good power, and you get to row through the gears. It's fantastic. I love it, absolutely love it. And yeah, for me, yes. For most people, probably not. And one thing to factor in on this is some people talk about when it comes to the cost, they say, oh, you know, if you're thinking about resale, don't, because if I were to sell this car now, it's going to have to be a very, very specific buyer. And with the money I've got in this thing at this point, no one's gonna give me what I've put into this thing. So get that out of your head. Resale is completely out the door when you do something like this. Now we'll get into things to know from the start before you even start really diving into this. Some things that I would have wished I knew when I first started. Some people you need to get a hold of, some people you need to talk to. Greg was at Pace Performance. Pace Performance is a parts dealer, parts vendor, mostly dealing in GM parts. I think maybe specifically dealing in GM parts. Greg is awesome because he was in on the forums back in 2010, 2012 when this sort of thing first got started up. He built a parts list, all GM parts. Now granted, some parts on that list are unavailable now, but his list reflects that. And if there's something that's unavailable now, he's been great with figuring out substitutions. Give you a quick example. This transmission, this TR6060, has an internal fluid pump that can run up to a cooler. We have an external cooler already on the car. And the lines, the GXP G8 lines no longer exist for the fluid. And we were going to get a 5th gen Camaro set of lines to run up to the front of the car. Well, he found Chevy SS sedan, manual of course, transmission fluid lines that were much cheaper than the Camaro ones, for example. And they worked really well. We had to do a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of bending, but they were pretty much plug and play. So that's an example of what Greg can do for you. So he is huge. Chris at TIC Performance, they specialize in transmission stuff. I spoke with Chris and told him what I was doing, manually swapping this car, and he knew exactly what I needed. He knew exactly what to suggest to me, and everything that we got from them, the clutch, flywheel, slave cylinder, accessories for the slave cylinder, everything was all perfect, went right in. We measured as you're supposed to with the clutch and the slave and all of that, but everything was perfect. So Chris was great, and I've asked Chris a couple technical questions since or while we were doing the install, and he's always been super friendly, always been super helpful. So highly recommend him. He's a good one to get a hold of. Get a tuner. Somebody to tune this car. That probably should be the number one thing you should look into first before anything, because you put all the parts in this car and you get it all set and done, but if you don't get it tuned right, it ain't gonna work. You gotta get a good tuner who knows how to make the computer understand what's happened here. And from what I've heard, Pat G out in Texas, if you're familiar with the G8 world, I've heard he's the man when it comes to manual tunes. That's at least what the internet says. However, I tried to get a hold of Pat G a couple times, couldn't get a hold of him, never heard back from him. I've heard that's an issue. So don't know about him, but I can tell you Adam Cooper is the one I used. Adam is the man. Adam has been tuning this car for a while now. The 6L80E that I pulled out of this car was built by Adam about 3 years ago. And he's been fantastic to work with. I didn't know he dealt with manual transmission stuff. I thought he was mostly just an automatic guy. So after I didn't get a hold of Pat G, I reached out to Adam and he said, yeah, I've done a few of those, no problem. And sure enough, as with everything that Adam does, we loaded the tune in the car, and when we went to crank the car, everything was great. Everything has been great since. So highly recommend him. I will tell you, he can be somewhat difficult to get a hold of because he is incredibly busy. So you got to be a little bit persistent. If you've never worked with him before, you've got to show that you're serious. That leads me into the next person I talked with. Find yourself a guru. Find yourself someone who has done this before, preferably to the way you want your car to be, you know, as far as what they've done, the parts they've used, etc. And become friends with them. Bounce ideas off of them. Ask them questions and all of that. But the thing I would say up front is show them that you're serious. For me, the guy that I was talking with a lot in this is named Dan. He's on Instagram as Pontiac G8. He's got a black manual swapped car. And one thing he talked to me about was, after we first started talking and then we started to get more in terms of conversation, he's like, man, I get so many questions from people about manual swapping these cars, and it's just kind of annoying because very rarely are they ever serious. So I would say, if you're going to start talking to these people, show them that you're serious. Talk about the parts, make sure you're really involved in this. Don't just sit there and start spamming people with a bunch of silly questions. Beyond that, feel free to ask questions in the comments here. If you want to ask silly questions and you're very much on the fence and you don't know, feel free to ask me questions in the comments. I check this sporadically. I'll be happy to answer back to you. But those 4 guys that I just mentioned were massively crucial to getting this car done. Just know, another thing to know, just know that parts can be substituted. I'm going to tell you how we did it, and I'll give you some alternatives that I've heard of at least. But just know there's multiple ways to skin a cat. Part of the reason why you don't really find a color by numbers explanation on how to swap these cars is because it depends on where you start and it depends on what you want. So a lot of different ways to go about doing this. Let's see. You will need a different rear end gear. The 292 that comes in this car ain't gonna cut it. With this manual transmission, you have that 292 back there, the car is gonna be an absolute dog. I have a 345 gear set in the back of this car. The whole differential came from a 5th gen Camaro. That's the normal way that people will swap those out. Just get a 5th gen diff and toss it up in there. It bolts right in. The axles are a little bit of a pain in the ass to get into the diff housing, but other than that, that's how it goes. The 345 gear ratio with this transmission, I top out second gear at about 71, 72 miles an hour. First gear is usable. It's not too tall, it's not too short, it's in a good spot. So I can recommend a 345 gear. You can probably make it work with a 327. Just make sure you get the limited slip if you do that. I think the GXP had a 370 gear ratio from the factory with the manual. The Camaro 1LEs I think have like a 390, 391, something along that line. I will tell you this though, to get a good condition, low mile 345, for example, out of a 5th gen Camaro, at this point, with shipping especially included, you're looking at paying close to $1,000 for that. Maybe a little bit less, but talking in terms of budget, that's what you need to look at. And it's only getting more expensive, along with other things. So I didn't even factor that in my total cost that I quoted to you earlier, because I already had that in the car. So that is one thing you're going to have to add in if you don't already have it. Here's another huge thing to know. Figure out, before you get into all of this, whether you can get the stock 2-piece drive shaft on this car shortened at a place near you, or if you're willing to ship it somewhere or whatever. Here's the problem I have with the internet, among many other problems. Everybody on the internet says when you go to swap one of these, oh, it's no big deal. Just take your 2-piece drive shaft down to your local drive shaft shop and they can shorten the front of it that goes to the transmission. They can shorten that about the inch and a half or so that you need. Make sure that you measure, of course. But they can shorten that, pops right back up in there, good to go. Crap! Lies and crap. Doomed Garage had the same exact issue. I had this issue. We took the 2-piece out. We went down to our local drive shaft shop, which is very well known, handles a lot of heavy hitting cars in the area. I live outside of Orlando, so I'm not in the sticks. But this is a very well known, established, pretty big business drive shaft shop. Walked in with my 2-piece. The guy behind the counter says, "What you want me to do with that?" And I said, "Oh, we just would like to shorten this a little bit, please, sir, thank you." And he looks at me and he goes, "Nope." And I say, "What do you mean, nope?" And he says, "I don't have the tools to balance that thing." He's like, "We can't do those." Here's the problem. The stock drive shafts in these cars have a 3-bolt flange on the transmission and the diff side. That's the issue. I called multiple different drive shaft shops all through the Central Florida area, even out towards Tampa, well-known, well-respected shops. None of them had the equipment to balance a 2-piece shaft with those 3-bolt flanges like that. Now, I've heard that there's a place in Portland that might be able to do it. There's a place maybe in California that might be able to do it. Denny's Driveshaft, I didn't check with them specifically if they could do it. They're out of, I think, Kentucky. But either way, we found ourselves in a bit of a pickle. So the alternative is to go with a single one-piece drive shaft with some sort of like a telescoping aspect to it to get the thing to fit up in there. If you go to G8only.com, they sell those sorts of things from Driveshaft Shop and Koza Performance. The problem, if you look on their website, they will tell you that they're about 8 weeks out as far as getting the drive shaft to you. And this is aluminum ones. I think carbon fiber may be more, I can't remember, but the carbon fiber ones are much more expensive. The aluminum ones are already expensive. So we went with the local Driveshaft shop to custom make us an aluminum drive shaft. And in the drive shaft alone, I have a little over $1,400 in this car. That's part of the price that I quoted you earlier. One thing, it's aluminum. Materials are expensive nowadays. It's got a telescoping aspect to it towards the front where the transmission is. It also, you have to run these two Sonax billet adapters on either side for that 3-bolt flange. And those Sonax adapters are about almost $250 each. So that's a big part of the cost. Here's the best part about all of it. It's not perfect, because right now, one of the things we're sorting out with this car is it picks up a bit of a vibration, a bit of a harmonic hum, not a bad vibration, but a little hum, almost like an exhaust drone at about 55 miles an hour. That continues up to about 75 miles an hour, and then beyond about 80, 85, it turns into a vibration. If you go and start doing more research about one-piece drive shafts in these cars, that's not that uncommon. Because one, you're dealing with the telescope issue that is known, I guess, to cause some vibration. The other issue is the drive shaft in this thing is over 5 feet long. And when you throw that number out to drive shaft guys, the response I've gotten from multiple people is, "Hoo-hoo, that's a long drive shaft." So that adds to it. Look up critical speed. I had to learn all about this. Critical speed when it comes to drive shafts. There's a particular diameter and thickness of the material and all of that goes into making these drive shafts to keep them from vibrating. And once you get that long, you start to have issues unless you go very wide in diameter. Here's the problem with going very wide in diameter with these cars. You cannot go wider than a 3.5-inch diameter drive shaft. Cannot do it, because where the drive shaft lives, up in that tunnel underneath the car, above that is where the e-brakes live, the e-brake cables, I should say. And there's these little metal round things that kind of hold them over towards the differential. Well, the big time drag race guys that run these cars and have the big power, and they'll run a 4-inch drive shaft, but they have to remove the e-brake cables and the little brackets up there. Well, you can't do that because you have a manual car. So the biggest you can possibly go is 3.5 inches. And I'm telling you, it is mega close at 3.5 inches. For example, you have to remove the heat shield that's back there by the gas tank. You have to get rid of that. It won't work with that drive shaft. We tried, and we had it rubbing on it under a torque demand. So that is part of the issue with these. Dan, the guy I've talked to, he ended up finally going with a custom 2-piece, which was, I think he said he's got like $1,800 into his drive shaft. So we're trying to figure all that out. Going back to G8only.com, if you go there and look at, say, for example, Koza's single-piece drive shaft that they sell, it's a chrome moly unit. They make no bones about the fact that this thing is going to vibrate. It's not meant to be, super smooth. It's meant to have big power run through it and get you down a track. So sort your drive shaft situation out before you start diving into this, because we were in the middle of it whenever we came across all those issues. Now, figure out, when you get into this, figure out what you're willing to live without. And here's what I mean by that. Are you willing to live without stability control, cruise control? Are you willing to live without a clutch safety switch? Because all of that comes into play with the wiring. I mentioned before the GXP wiring harness, you can't get that anymore for the manual car. It used to be you could just get that wiring harness for the manual, pop out your old harness, pop in your new harness, everything went right in. As long as you got your tune right, the car would perform as if it were factory. Nowadays, that's not the case. Your only hope to go that route is to go through Australian eBay and try to find you what's called a wire loom, that's what they call it over there, for a VE Commodore manual. And good luck. I tried that a few times, was unsuccessful. Doomed Garage actually was able to get one. I don't know how much he paid for it. I'm sure you're probably going to pay through the nose. And then you're also going to hope that it shows up eventually and it's not damaged and works. So we ended up not going that route. We went with very minimal wiring on this car as it stands right now. And the car completely works. Everything, the car runs and drives as it should. But for example, I don't have stability control. That's fine by me because I turn that off anyway when I autocross and I don't drive like a crazy person on the street. I knew that was going to not be there whenever we cranked the car up for the first time. I don't even have a clutch safety switch right now wired in. We have the ability to wire that in if we want to, but we didn't bother with that just yet. Cruise control I haven't tested to see if I even have it, but I'd imagine I probably don't. And we do, however, have reverse lights, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later. That took some doing, but we do at least have reverse lights. That's a common issue on these swapped cars that don't run the full-on wiring harness. Either way, figure out what you're willing to live without. If you want this thing to be 100% OEM, you're going to need somebody who knows how to do wiring, more in-depth wiring, specifically grafting into a wiring harness to make everything work. There's people out there that can do it. I've seen one guy named Brad, I think, was able to build a harness for this thing, and apparently it all worked. But just know that's an issue that you need to figure out ahead of time. Beyond that, keep checking the forums, keep checking the Facebook groups, keep checking YouTube. There's always new stuff popping up every day. The reverse light fix, I just recently posted that to the G8 owners Facebook group and got a lot of likes because that seems like that's been an ongoing issue for like 10 years now. So we figured that out at least. Moving on to the next thing, I'm going to tell you about the parts that we have in this car, just to give you an idea and some lists of alternatives. So I'm going to run through this relatively quickly. The transmission in this car is I said before, Tremec TR6060 specifically for the GXP, and that is GM part number 922-36239. And I found this transmission purely by a Google search of the model number, the GM part number. And the thing that I had realized is Pace Performance JEGs were selling this transmission, but it was discontinued about 2+ years ago. They sold out about 1.5 to 2 years ago, and both of them were advertising that transmission for sale for about $4,200 and change. That doesn't include shipping. Well, out of a random thing, I thought basically the ship had already sailed because I really wanted the GXP transmission. I did a random Google search one day of that number and it came up a website called gmpartsgiant.com. What I've realized is they're kind of like a middleman, a big middleman for what seems to be service departments, dealerships, things of that nature. They showed one for sale and the price was incredibly low. And so I called their tech support, customer support. I talked to somebody in like Bombay, India, and I said, do you have this available? They were looking at the same website I was. They're like, yeah, I think so. I'm like, okay, if I order this thing and something else shows up, can I send it back? And they said yes. So I ordered it, shipped to my buddy's shop. This thing was $2,900 and change. So my only thought is that this thing was probably sitting on somebody's shelf. I think it was out of Wisconsin. Some dealership service department shelf sitting there, and some manager came in and said, get this thing out of here. No one's ever going to need this thing. I don't even know what this is, or something like that, because it showed up in the box. Everything was perfect, and the box had a ton of dust on the top of it. So I don't know. Well, with that, I was all excited, so I went to a Facebook group, the G8 Owners Facebook group, and I announced my amazing discovery. And somebody tried to come in and buy one from GM Parts Giant, and they were told, nope, sorry, we don't have any more. So I may have very well gotten the very last one in the damn country. I'm not sure. But I haven't seen any since for sale, like brand new ones. So if you are to jump into this, you're probably most likely going to be using a Camaro, 5th gen Camaro TR6060 to do this swap. Nothing wrong with that. Everything will work just fine. The Camaro transmission, from what I understand, is a little bit longer. And I don't know where it gets that extra length. I've heard, I think it's in the bell housing area, But either way, I know because of the extra length, your shifter location is a little bit further back, so you have to make accommodations for that. And your cross member, how you attack the cross member, you might have to do some like custom fabrication. I've heard using a mount for a Turbo 400 will work for you. But I don't know that for a fact. But from what I've heard, you will have to possibly be cutting a cross member up a little bit or something to make that work. But people have done it. Plenty of people have done it. Now, clutch, slave cylinder, release bearing support, speed bleeder, and remote reservoir. Those all were from TIC Performance. And the clutch is a monster clutch. It is their S series twin disc, is their base model twin disc. With the flywheel, it was just shy of $1,100. It's a good piece, a good part. It should be for that kind of money. And I can tell you the pedal feel is like stock. Supposedly the clutch can handle, I don't know, 800 horsepower or something. The car will never make that kind of power, but it's a good unit. The flywheel is their standard weight flywheel. It's not their lightweight flywheel. Their website talks about the lightweight flywheel is more for a motorsport application. I could see that because driving this around, the revs rise and fall at, you know, a nice normal rate. A lightweight flywheel, they'll rise and fall quicker, make it a little bit more clunky to get through on daily driving type situations. But I can say everything's been great with the clutch and all of that. There's a little bit of chatter right now because we're still in the break-in period. I heard that goes away. But other than that, it's been absolutely fine. The slave cylinder is actually for a GXP. They actually still sell those. TIC had it and sold it to me. They included, the speed bleeder was already plugged in to the slave cylinder. They put that in there for me, installed it for me. And the release support bearing, what that is inside the GM slave cylinders, there's a plastic support bearing that's in there. And if you subject it to a lot of heat, a lot of abuse, that plastic will get weak and break, and it turns the slave cylinder into like a busted slinky. So the release support bearing that they sell is a billet piece that goes down in there and reinforces everything. And so they put that in there for you if you want. That cost me like 95 bucks. So, and to me, that's good insurance. The remote reservoir is for the clutch. This is a hydraulic clutch, and you need to have a little reservoir under the hood to put your clutch fluid in. It's actually .4 brake fluid, but we got that. Comes with a little custom little metal arm that you can bend and twist and use it to mount it to wherever you want to mount it to. For us, it lives right about here, kind of where the horn used to live. We relocated the horn, and it sits right there in that corner. The GXPs have it pretty much in that location. The clutch pedal assembly, we got that from Lisi Parts. It's for a ZL1 5th gen Camaro, and it came with a brake pedal assembly. We didn't use the brake pedal assembly. We just used the clutch assembly. It's just how they sold them together as a pair. The reason I went with the ZL1, two reasons. One, the return spring on the ZL1, I've read, is an upgraded piece because 5th gen Camaros apparently had an issue with the clutch return spring being a little weak and the clutch not coming back all the time. Whatever, that's just what I read. The main other reason I went with the ZL1 is because the pedal design, the pedal cover, matched my existing brake pedal and accelerator pedal. So it looks uniform because I'm a nerd, and that was important to me. You'll see by the picture I'm posting up that the brake pedal, we kept the same size, the stock automatic brake pedal. You can grind that down and put a different pedal cover over it if you want to do that. Some people have swapped out the actual brake pedal assembly itself with the Camaro unit. I've heard there's issues that people have run into with that. Like they'll have to go through a Tech 2 and get the car to relearn the brakes. We didn't do any of that. We just left the stock brake pedal in there, including the pad. I like it because I can actually reach the pedal for heel toe type downshifting. It hasn't been a problem. And I like it also because it looks kind of weird. People look at that and they're like, wait a minute, you know. So yeah. The MGW shifter that we have in the car, the MGW makes a fabulous product. And we didn't go with the stock shifter. We did run into a bit of an issue, not MGW's fault. I'll talk about that in the things that we came across, but the MGW, it's for a 5th gen Camaro fitment. They don't make one specifically for a G8, but it's amazing because you get an MGW shifter for a 5th gen Camaro and it bolts right onto the transmission as if it's designed for it. It goes right up into the transmission tunnel perfectly. The bolts align perfectly. Everything's great. It's a fantastic unit. I will tell you though, there were actually two issues we had with the MGW. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. Transmission wiring pigtails. If you want to wire things up to the transmission, like for example your reverse lights, the little pigtails that you need are on Amazon. It's a company called Muzzies, MUZZY''S. They make, it's for a T56 is the way it's labeled, but it's 3 little pigtails, and that's what you need to wire this thing up. It's 20 bucks on Amazon. Shout out to Dan for telling me about that. Shifter boot, we went with Redline Goods. They're well known in the G8 community and manual transmission community. They make a really nice leather shift boot. The one thing I would tell you is, because you're kind of having to bunch it up down there in the shifter hole in the center console because you don't have the right trim ring, those are pretty much impossible to find, I would recommend getting like an extended length boot to have you some extra material. That way you can hook it up or zip tie it or do whatever you want to do to kind of secure it. I've got the normal size shift boot. It's a little tight in some areas. We're making it work. Knowing what I know now, I would have gone for a little bit more material to work with. Let's see, drive shaft, I already told you about all of that. That thing, it's from Advanced Driveline in Orlando. The vibration harmonic issue I talked about, I'm not going to really blame on them. I think they made a good piece. I think it's just an issue with circumstance and what we had to do to get it in the car. So they've been great to work with. No issues with them. Final thing I will talk about in terms of stuff from Pace Performance. I mentioned Greg in the very beginning. Greg was from Pace Performance. I spent $410 with them, $410.27 to be specific, and a lot of that was like small stuff, pins, bolts, all the proper stuff, the pilot bearing that you need, the like little things that you're not really going to think about, some little bit bigger things like the transmission fluid cooler lines. Another thing is the cross member. The GXP cross member for the manual transmission does still exist. And I don't know why. I'm kind of surprised by that, but it comes with the right transmission mount and all of that. I ordered that from Greg, and that came in. It's perfect. Went right in, looks totally factory because it basically is. Funny thing also, I'll post a picture. It came with an upside down sticker, said made in, was it product of Australia, made in Australia. You see the picture. I thought that was funny, especially because it's upside down. All right, now we'll go into how we did it and the issues we faced along the way. Step 1, load the new tune into the car before you do anything else. We did not test this theory, but according to the internet, if you do all the work, swap the transmission, do everything you need to do, and then try to load the tune in afterwards, the first thing that the car is going to do is when you turn the key into the on position, it's going to look for the TCM. That is no longer in the car because it was a part of the automatic transmission, right? Well, when it doesn't find that TCM, supposedly the car just freaks out and says, nope, do not pass go, do not collect $200, we ain't doing nothing. And you can't load a new tune, the car will not start, all these issues that people have reported. The only way to reverse that or fix that is to get the TCM, plug it in to the wiring harness that's there, and try to make the car see it that it's there again. So what everybody has said is before you do anything, load the manual tune into the car. So there you go. Another thing I'll add about the tune, I'm not a tuner. I know how to do data logs. I know how to load tunes. That's what I know how to do. Adam is the master at that sort of stuff, and I leave that all up to him. From what I've read, the tuning part, I already mentioned how crucial it is, but it can be a little confusing, because these cars came in 08, 09, 09 and a half. I've heard of some people using the 08 manual Commodore tune that's on the HP Tuners repository and making that work and splicing that in somehow to make that work on the car. I've also heard of some people using the manual GXP tune that I think is also on the HP Tuners repository. But I've also heard of people trying to load in a tune from, say, an 09.5 GXP onto an 08 car, and it bricks the ECU. And so then they've got to go get a new computer. I've heard there's something to do with the operating systems. There's different operating systems on these ECUs, depending on, I guess, model year. There's a lot of there be dragons type situation out there. So I'm not gonna lie, I totally trust Adam, but when we went to first turn that key after we had everything in, I was like wincing a little bit of like, dear God, I hope this works. So once again, super crucial, get you a good tuner or somebody who's done this before, or somebody who can really do the research and get it right. So after you've loaded the tune, begin to pull the lower dash where you sit as a driver, pull from the headlight switch on down to the under dash plastics. Pull all of the interior plastics out. You're going to need to get those out of your way, and pull up the center console plastics. Best tool I found is you go on Amazon, it's like $7. You get yourself the interior plastic removal kit. It's like 3 pieces, and one of them is like a little plastic crowbar. It's awesome. Everything just pops right up. You can get that guy down in there and pop everything up nice and easy. Take your time, but everything pops pretty much up or out. Okay, now that you've got the plastics off and you've loaded the tune in the car, we'll go to the next thing, which is right there underneath the steering wheel, there is this metal frame, and it's got 2 aluminum pieces hooked to it. It almost looks like it's something where if you were into a crash, that's where it would direct your knees under the dash or something like that. Take that metal frame out. It looked to us like it was tack welded in, and come to find out it's not. It's held in by 6 screws and like 3 bolts. So take that out. Don't be like me and fight around that thing through pretty much the whole process and then discover that that thing could have easily came out, because when you go to install your clutch pedal, it gets pretty tight in there, and that makes it so much easier to get that thing out of there. So next, you remove the exhaust, the drive shaft, the transmission, and the automatic shifter. The automatic shifter has the linkage down underneath, and it also has, I think it's 4 screws that hold it into the center console. Pop that thing out of there. Of course, make sure that you've already unplugged your window switches for the center trim plastic, and also the plugs that go into that automatic shifter. Now we'll go into, if you have an external transmission cooler like we do, or if you're planning to use the one that's there in the radiator, whatever, either way, make sure you flush it all out, because this transmission takes Dexron 3. The automatic takes Dexron 6. Dexron 3 is per Tremec. That's what it says on their website, so that's what we ran with it. For wiring, I told you before we did minimal wiring on this thing. Here's the wiring that we did. In that center console where the shifter just came out of, you're going to see for the shifter plug, there is a purple and white wire and a black wire. I think there's like 3 different purple and white wires, so find the right one. You might have to do a little trial and error. But jumper the black wire with the purple and white wire. Jumper those 2 together, because what that's going to do is unlock your key cylinder so you can get the key out of the car. If you don't do that, it's going to hold the key in and won't let the key out. So that is something you have to do. The other part of wiring, underneath the car where the transmission plug is for the automatic transmission, that wiring harness right there. Get yourself a wiring harness diagram, they're out there. Inside of that harness, there's going to be 2 brown wires and 2 brown and black wires. Those are the CAN bus wires. You're going to want to jumper those together. And what that does, as far as I understand it, that creates a signal loop to tell the car that it can start. It's, I guess, like maybe a neutral safety. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the way it was explained to me is you've got to jumper those wires. I can tell you we did test that kind of inadvertently. We didn't do that at first because honestly we didn't quite understand what was the need for that. And when we went to start the car would not start. Wasn't having it. It was throwing up like low fuel and contact dealer and all this and that. We went and jumpered those wires. Car fired right up. Everything was good. All those crazy warning lights were gone. So that is crucial. And it's funny, Dan is the one who told me about that. When I talked to Adam Cooper about it, he knew it before I even said it. So it's a known thing. You got to do that to get the car to start. The other thing would be for the wiring of the reverse lights. Here's how I'll explain you do that. I've got pictures that should be popping up here. Under the hood on the passenger side, kind of over where the strut tower is, there's a harness. Cut into that harness, there is a light green wire. It's the same sort of light green wire that GM has been using for reverse lights since, I don't know, the 70s, maybe older, I don't know. But either way, it's a light green wire. That light green wire runs back to your reverse lights. We tapped into him. We ran a wire from that green wire. We also tapped into the fuse box that's right there on that same passenger side. There's a 15 amp fuse that controls the reverse lights. We tapped a wire into that, ran 2 individual wires, one from the green wire, one from the fuse, down under into the back of the firewall, down along the bottom of the car to the reverse light switch in the transmission, and wired that in. So whenever you throw the car in reverse, it gets the power from the fuse box, goes to that switch. The switch says, okay, we're in reverse now, runs the power back up, the signal back up into that green wire that you tapped into, which then goes to your reverse lights. Boom, you have reverse lights. I also have a backup camera that's been wired into this car for a while. The backup camera comes up perfectly, everything's great. So that's how we did it. I've heard there's another way to do it where you can tap into the body control module. Apparently that green wire is there, and the body control module almost uses as like a grounding. I don't know the full ins and outs of that, but G8 owners group on Facebook, I made a post talking about it, and somebody chimed in and explained the body control module aspect of it if you wanted to do it that way. So there's two different ways to do that. That apparently has been an issue for a long time, people getting these cars up and running but not having reverse lights. Two different solutions for you right there. As far as your speedometer, you should have no issues with your speedometer. Ours is 100% accurate because the car uses the wheel speed sensors. It no longer uses the vehicle speed sensor for the transmission. It uses the speed sensors. And that was, I believe, in the tune. I don't know what voodoo was used in all that, but all I know is it's been great ever since we fired the car up. Now, you've done your wiring stuff. Install the slave cylinder on the transmission, and I'll tell you this, supposedly, as an alternative, you could use like an LS7 clutch instead of like the twin disc that we did. I don't know how that's going to fit with a Camaro transmission, but I've heard it works. And I've heard you can maybe use a Corvette slave cylinder with the Camaro transmission to make all of that work. I don't know if you got to shim it. I don't know what the deal is with that. You're going to want to talk to somebody like Chris at Tick Performance to make sure you get everything sorted right. But the thing I've heard with I think it's the Corvette slave cylinder, is you might have to etch out part of the transmission where that Corvette slave cylinder goes. You might have to etch some of that out to get a good mounting point to get it to bolt in. But that's all things to talk to somebody who really knows, like the boys over at Tick maybe. Then you install, okay, we installed our slave on our trans. You install your clutch, your flywheel, transmission slave cylinder. We get it all up into the car. We installed the shifter, the MGW shifter, on top of the transmission before we put all that in there. So the shifter went kind of right up into place. We were able to bolt it up the rest of the way once the transmission was in there. That's how we did it. You can do it different ways. Make sure you measure. Tick will actually send you a instruction sheet on how to measure for your slave cylinder gaps and things like that as far as your clutch goes, to make sure you don't have too much initial contact and you don't have you're not enough, all that sort of stuff. So super helpful from them. And luckily we were dead on. We didn't have to worry about shimming anything or doing anything like that. Here's an issue we ran into with that shifter though. All right, so when you buy a transmission, chances are most of you are probably going to be buying a takeout transmission, like something that came out of a car, it's used. Most of them come with the shifter assembly. Make sure if you're doing it that way, you get that shifter assembly, even if you're going to be using an aftermarket shifter. Here's why. If you buy the transmission brand new, the TR6060 comes with an external, it kind of comes out of the transmission. It's got this little arm that comes out towards the back. And the shifter, actually, it's a remote style shifter. It bolts to the outside of the transmission. And in between the shifter assembly and this little stub out from the transmission, there is a linkage rod that goes, shifter to transmission linkage. That rod, you move the shifter, that moves the shifter or the linkage inside of the transmission, selects your gears. When you buy the transmission brand new, it doesn't come with that center linkage rod. When you buy an aftermarket shifter like an MGW, it also doesn't come with that center linkage rod. So that's why getting a stock shifter with these transmissions is crucial. You may throw away the entire stock shifter, but that center linkage rod, you need that because, what we learned, that center linkage rod, as far as we could find, does not have its own individual part number. It only comes with the entire, what's called a shifter control, which is basically the entire shifter assembly from the OEM. We had to buy a SS sedan manual shifter, brand new, from Pace, to get that one stupid linkage rod in the center, because we didn't know one, for example, it does curve. It kind of does an S curve. We didn't even know that. And we didn't know how long it was supposed to be, so we couldn't make our own. So that was an issue that we ran into. But Greg was super helpful again, because I was going to get a 5th gen Camaro shifter, which was a little bit more expensive. Greg found that the SS sedan shifter is cheaper. That's what we bought. I do not know if the SS sedan manual stock shifter will bolt into this car perfectly. We didn't test that. I already had the MGW. So just know, get that center linkage rod one way or another. Don't be like me and having to buy a complete shifter that you don't need just to get one stupid part out of it. Here's the other issue with the MGW that we ran into. Once again, not MGW's fault. For the manual GXP versions of this car, the center console trim, the shifter hole itself, on that center console trim, the shifter hole is moved down about a ½ inch to an inch on the manual versions of these cars. That center console trim, you're not finding that anywhere in the States. Does not exist, can't get it. I found 2 for manual VE Commodores on Australian eBay, and one was $660 and the other was like $820 something just for that center console plastic. And so I said, bump that. Here's why it's like that though. Keep in mind, this is a GXP transmission. The shifter is an aftermarket, but it should be for the right car. We have contact with the center console trim ring around the shifter hole. It's that silver trim ring that goes around the shifter hole. I have contact barely in 2nd, 4th, and 6th gear, because one of the reasons is also I'm using the flat stick from MGW, which just comes straight up off the shifter, like straight up off. So I have a ton of room 1st, 3rd, 5th in reverse. I don't have as much room in the back 2nd, 4th, and 6th. If you order the OEM shifter, OEM style shifter from MGW, they sell it a flat stick and they sell an OEM style. The OEM style is offset. It actually moves the shift stick forward about an inch. And if I would have done that, it would be absolutely perfect and I would have had no issues. However, what I've had to do is I called MGW. They will sell you it's called an offset upper for the flat stick, but it's a special order item. So I had to take my flat stick off, send it back to them, because they actually have to like machine it to get the offset upper on there. When I get it back from them, my flat stick will be moved up almost an inch, which will then allow me perfect clearance with the center console. I tell you all that to tell you this, especially if you're using the Camaro transmission, you're going to want to look into at least some sort of an offset upper to get yourself forward, because remember, the shifter location is going to be back a little bit. So you're going to want to at least look into some sort of an offset upper, something that will move that shift stick forward, so that way you're not hitting your center console trim. The way we got around it in the beginning was I just popped that little center silver trim ring off, and that gave me all the room I needed. But it just looks dumb. I want to have it look complete. So that's why MGW's got the solution for me, but it's been a bit of a hassle to get that figured out. Now let's see what else we have here. Okay, now we'll go into installing the clutch pedal, which is a pain in the ass. There's no way around that. The clutch pedal comes to you as, all right, so we're going to look at it from the side, okay? This is a clutch pedal arm. This is the pad. This is where your foot goes. It pushes the clutch in like this, right? Up at the top of the clutch pedal assembly, there is a big silver bracket that runs front to back. In the front of that bracket, there are 2 bolt holes. Those correspond to a bracket that's already in this car. If you get on your back in the driver's side floorboard and crawl yourself underneath the dash and look up into the dash, you're going to see a bracket come down. It's about kind of behind where the headlight switch would be. You'll see a bracket come down and it's got 2 bolt holes and they're threaded on the back. They got like threaded nuts that are tacked on. That's where that bracket for the clutch goes. The 2 bolt holes line up with that absolutely perfectly. You got to get the right bolts. They're common size bolts. I can't remember the size, but you get 2 grade 8 bolts, 10.9 metrics, and that's where the clutch bracket bolts in there. Fantastic. On the other side of the clutch bracket, we're back to the side view, okay? On the back of the clutch bracket, there is a bolt stud, and the master cylinder that comes out like this. Clutch has its own master cylinder, clutch pedal assembly has its own master cylinder. That's kind of an upside down heart shape. You're going to have to drill those 3 holes into your firewall to get the clutch pedal to slip through, and you use nuts on the firewall side and under the hood to secure the clutch pedal. And that's where you plug your lines to the master cylinder as it sticks through the firewall. That is a bit of a pucker factor because you're drilling into your firewall. There's a big metal plate that you have to drill through to get this thing to work. The problem is you can't line it up absolutely perfectly because of the studs in the master cylinder against the firewall is going to throw off your mounting point for the bolt holes up top at that top bracket. So you kind of have to get it in there, get it positioned, kind of figure, make it work. I think I'm good. Measure, 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 and then mark, 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 and start drilling. Where it comes out under the hood, those two studs and the master cylinder come through at about the 5 o'clock location to the brake master cylinder. Some people have talked about removing the brake master cylinder to give you more room to deal with all of this under the hood. We didn't do that. We left the brake master cylinder where it was, although we fought because it is tight confines here in this little corner where all of that lives. So that's up to you, but that's just know you can get away without removing the brake master cylinder. It's just going to be tight, but measure twice, measure 3 times, cut once, because you screw that up, you might be in a little bit of a pickle. But we did it, got it in there, everything was fine. The issue we had with our particular clutch pedal assembly, this is a little bit of a beef I have with Leasey parts. We get the clutch pedal installed, everything's in there, great. We plug in the lines. You have a line that runs from the clutch fluid reservoir down into the clutch master cylinder. So you pop a line on there. And then you have a line that comes from the bottom port on the clutch fluid master cylinder, clutch pedal master cylinder. You have the top port, you have the bottom port. The bottom port runs down to your slave in your transmission. Well, the top one, we got on there, everything's fine. The bottom one, we got that line, the actual line that runs to the slave cylinder, we got that from Pace Performance. It's a combination hard line, soft line. And it's a little bit of a pain to get it up in there from underneath the car, but you can route it. Just make sure you avoid your headers and your steering linkage and all that. Well, we go to plug that in to the clutch pedal master cylinder. Pop, pop, goes in, feels great. We go to bleed the clutch. That line pops off. Can't figure out why. Okay, maybe we didn't get it on there good enough. Get it on there. And I'm having to reach down because it's tight. I'm having to like reach down backwards and all this sort of stuff to get it on there. Get it on there again. Go to bleed the clutch. Line pops off again. Keep in mind this is spilling brake fluid all inside the engine compartment of the car. What we found out is Leasey Parts sent the clutch pedal assembly without the little metal retaining clip that's supposed to go on that port. We didn't realize that. Didn't realize it didn't have it. It's almost like a really bent up and twisted paper clip. And that caused a problem for us. Luckily, we had another slave cylinder nearby that had the exact same clip on it that we were able to pirate and pop it onto the clutch pedal assembly port. And sure enough, we do that. The line hasn't popped off. Everything's been great. So if you get a used clutch pedal assembly, make sure it comes with everything to include that little tiny metal retaining clip, because you will also have brake fluid in your engine compartment. So let's see here. Beyond that, it's DOT4 brake fluid that we use for the clutch and the slave. We've done all that. Now we've got the wiring, we've got the transmission in, we've got all that stuff, clutch pedals in. Now we do the drive shaft. The drive shaft, keep in mind, the stock drive shaft has these little rubber guibos on the front and back, transmission side, diff side. You're getting rid of those, at least according to what we were told. We may experiment with those to see if those will help kind of slow down some of the vibrations. But either way, we were told, no, get rid of those. It's a metal on metal type connection. I think Drive Shaft Shop, the one that they sell from G8only.com, has the same issue. I think maybe the Koza one does as well. It doesn't use those rubber guibo things. Because of that, your hardware is going to change. The bolts that you used that were in with the drive shaft, you can't use those anymore because now you don't have as much length to work with. So we had to make a couple runs to Ace Hardware and get us some bolts and nuts and things that were lock washers, things like that. So just know you're probably going to have to do that as well. Unless maybe you get one from Drive Shaft Shop or Koza and they supply all the hardware. I don't know if they do. Now, with that drive shaft install, I already told you, there's a big thick heat shield, protective shield near where the gas tanks are. You've got to remove that. We tried to run with it, didn't work. You got to remove that to get you enough room. And one thing we did do though is the e-brakes are up, the e-brake cables are up above that drive shaft. We did pull the driver's side one down and kind of create like a little hook brackety kind of thing to hold it away from the drive shaft because it was kind of lightly touching. The passenger side one has been fine, but you have to monitor just to make sure you don't have any rubs or anything like that once you get everything installed. Now we reinstalled the exhaust, put the exhaust back up. The GXP crossmember does not come with exhaust hangers. Luckily for you, the stock crossmember exhaust hangers are bolt-in. So just unbolt them from your stock G8 crossmember. If you're using the GXP crossmember, they bolt right in, put them right in there, and boom, your exhaust hangers go right on like they're supposed to, and everything was fine. Now you've got everything assembled, hopefully, and you go to fire it up and everything is good. One thing you're going to need to keep in mind, this is a good sign if you have a good tuner, is if your tuner wants to keep tuning the car, it's not going to be a one and done deal when it comes to the tune, because your load on your engine is completely different now with this new transmission. This was explained to me. I honestly didn't know this beforehand. But now the load on the motor is completely different. So that was something that Adam was certain to make sure he got right, had to go around and do some data logging, had to keep going back and forth with him to get the car the way he wanted it. It took about eight different revisions of the tune to get the car to where he was happy. And I mean, the car pulls great. It's super fun. Everything is flawless when it comes to the tune. And Adam is a perfectionist, and I love him for it. So just know you're not done with the tuning just in a one-shot deal. Now, from here, if you wanted to wire up anything else, you could. Like I said, we've got our clutch safety switch that we could wire up if we want to. I'm good without it. Reverse lockout if you want, that sort of stuff, it's there. You know, there's no real order of when you need to wire that up. I already told you about the reverse lights. That's here in my notes. We already covered that. Now, we'll go straight to the end of this because that's pretty much it. You're going to have a shakedown because you've done pretty much major surgery on this thing. So you want to make sure all your bolts are tight and go make sure everything's good. And make sure your tune's good, make sure your wiring's good, all of that. Take some time. You're gonna have to break in the clutch. Monster Clutch suggests 500 miles to break that clutch in through, good kind of city driving. And yeah, from there, here's the takeaways on all of it. It took us, and time-wise, it took us a couple weekends to knock this out. Knowing what we know now, we could knock this out in one good weekend. If we had all the parts right and everything, we could knock it out in one good weekend. The drivetrain noise, just know, MGW supplies you with padding, sound insulation, and stuff like that to hopefully quell some of the noise that's going to come up through that shifter hole, but you're going to get more. That's just how it is. It's not bad. It's not a problem. It's just noticeable. It's just going to be a thing that you're going to hear more drivetrain noise through that transmission. The long single piece drive shaft, I already talked about that. That is an issue that we're working with and trying to solve. People have said good things about carbon fiber ones. Don't know about all that. I really don't want to spend that kind of money, but just know that might be something you're also going to have to figure out and worry about there. One solution for that with the drive shaft, supposedly some people have said, is to convert this TR6060 to a slip yoke style. Basically, you turn the rear end of the thing to a T56. Problem with that though, the place that sells the parts to do that is Denny's Drive Shaft. I already mentioned them. I called Tick first and asked them if they had a kit to do that. They said, nope, we used to get our stuff from Denny's and we haven't gotten anything from them in quite a while. I called Denny's. Denny's said, we haven't had parts to offer up those kits for at least a year. We don't know when we're getting parts to offer up for those kits, and we don't even know how much it will cost. So right now, that's not an option to convert this thing to a slip yoke and change the drive shaft to a slip yoke. So you're kind of stuck with what you got. Is it terrible? No, driving around town is perfectly fine. In fact, if you drop the windows at 55, you don't even notice any sort of a harmonic. It's only at really like higher highway speeds, but it's something that I'm gonna wanna dial out of this car at some point. Is the car riding like an old Cadillac or an old Lincoln? Absolutely not, because of all the issues I already talked about, noise, vibration, harshness. It's a modified sports car, look at it that way. You're going to have a little bit more, but it's totally livable, totally fine. Just know if you go through all of this and you're expecting it to be like floating on a cloud and no noises or anything, no, it's going to have some. But other than that, I just told you some negatives. Other than all that, the car is so fun. I will say it definitely feels more sporty, and probably because it has less drivetrain loss now, because going from that automatic to a manual. But keeping it in a gear and just, you know, getting on it a little bit and pulling through that gear, it's a blast, man. I wish they would have made more like this. They should have. They should have made more manual cars over here like this. But yeah, highly recommend it if you're willing to take it on. If you're willing to spend the money and spend the time, highly recommend it. It can definitely be done. And any questions, feel free, drop them into the comments and I'll check them sporadically. Otherwise, good luck and Godspeed.